And he'd never give me the answer. We're just going to go through this. We're going to think about the best way to solve that problem. And we'd sit there for hours. And of course, sometimes that would involve tears. Hi, I'm Tom Drogalis, writer of Divine Power Made Me. You can find me on Instagram at Tom_Drogalis_ and Tom Drogalis on Twitter. And you're watching and listening to Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today by a very talented individual. He is a comic creator, a writer. He's a very amazing person in itself because I've gotten to read his incredible comic, Divine Power Made Me. Interesting title, very interesting guest. We are joined by the ever-talented Tom Drogalis. How you doing today?
Good morning, Kurt. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you this morning.
That's good having you here. And by the way, the Drogalis last name, I thought I was going into Game of Thrones there. I mean, it was just, you had a very strong last name and a very interesting comic, and I can't wait to dive into it here. For those that don't know anything about yourself as a creative person, tell us who you are and what you're bringing to Two Geeks Talking today.
I only kind of started delving into the writing world a bit more recently. It was about 3 years ago. It was around near the time of when COVID was starting to hit its strides, or when it was at its height. I had always loved comics, comic books, the medium in itself. I really wanted to push myself and do something out of my comfort zone, write a story on a topic that I was very passionate about. I do have a mild writing background, but it was definitely not creative in a sense. It was a bit more strict. My background is in criminal justice and psychology. So most of my writing would probably be more in like research papers. I did one research paper on the effects of like marijuana and schizophrenia. And I think I did a couple of papers on personality disorders. But so as you could kind of imagine, it's a bit of a leap to go from schizophrenia to the topic that I wrote about in Divine Power Made Me. And just to add a little bit more context on the title, because you did mention that it's a more interesting title. I'm a big fan of Dante's Inferno. And Divine Power Made Me is one, at least in my translation, the one of the words that is above the gates of hell. So it's kind of like a double entendre, where on a lot of the covers you see these horrific monsters, but you have that title that kind of is a stark contrast to what you're seeing on the covers. So Divine Power Made Me, like this god or gods created these monsters, but also created all these other things. So I wanted to look into topics like that.
Lot to dive into, obviously, here. It's a great comic, beautiful colors. I love the fact that, now that you mentioned Dante's Inferno, it didn't trigger for me, but now that just in thinking about, obviously, that amazing story in itself and that journey of that particular hero or anti-hero, however you want to call it, depends on your point of view, versus what you created here with Divine Power Made Me, I think is a great juxtaposition when it comes to everything. It's a great story, a great read. What is the pitch of Divine Power Made Me?
Yeah, so I mean, my log line was Virgil, a 14-year-old boy, is executed at the hands of a religious cult and finds himself in the afterlife making a deal with the first god. So we kind of meet the first god in issue 1, in that those first 5 pages, the first being is creating, in a sense, this Earth-like planet, and is very afraid because they're kind of just developing sentience as they're just walking around and realizing they're by themselves. I think humanity has done this for a long time, of when they can't explain things, they go to some kind of creationist story. That's how this being, who it happens to be, I think in the beginning it says being is filled with an immense amount of power. The power from essentially the Big Bang accidentally creates the first god. So we get that glimpse of that hulking, muscular horn being, and that is going to be one of the other main characters in the story. I won't tell you how they get introduced or anything like that, although I'd love to. I've always been a big spoiler guy. For example, I read a lot of One Piece,
Yeah.
and I'm on the One Piece subreddit, and every single week I'm reading those spoilers before the chapter comes out because I'm like, I gotta know what happens, and then I get to read it. So it's like two for the price of one. I get the spoilers at the like early in the week, and then later in the week I get the actual chapter. So it's two for the price of one.
When it comes though to being a first time writer, obviously that's got to be, a little daunting, a little scary, maybe, because it is, like you said, a completely different avenue here. Why did you want to give yourself a challenge, and why did you want to shift into the world of comics?
I mean, that's a great question, Kurt. I love the medium, and it's a completely different way of thinking. And I've always been more of a visual storyteller. For example, if I was, 3 years ago and I decided that I wanted to write a novel, I don't think I could do it. I really, really, I don't. I think that it's a two completely different mindsets, and I know there are people that would probably argue with me about that, but I think that when I'm writing, I see everything kind of moving in my head, almost like a movie and or like a TV show or just as a comic in itself, being able to kind of just lay everything out and really visualize things while I'm writing definitely makes it a bit easier for me personally. Like I was saying a little bit earlier, is the main reason that I wanted to challenge myself is because at the end of the day, I feel like anyone who gets in this field is because they have a story to tell. I had this story about Virgil, a name taken from Dante's Inferno, the main poet, who is the guide of Dante in the book. When I first actually started coming up with the idea, it was much closer to Dante's Inferno. And then as I started delving into the topic and the ideas started evolving, it really just became its own thing. And there's kind of just little nods here and there to Dante, but now it's its own complete new story. And honestly, a lot of the themes changed while writing the story as well. Early on, it was a heavier focus on religious themes, but then the more I started writing, the more it became stories about relationships between people and their family, and family that you end up making instead of family that you're born with. So I really wanted to tackle those themes and look at the moral gray areas of humanity. During my day job, I work with people who are seriously mentally ill on Rikers Island. So a lot of the guys that I work with have done some pretty bad stuff or are accused of doing some pretty bad stuff. But then that begs the question of, don't they also deserve to be helped, and what are they entitled to? So I just kind of wanted to explore the idea of, can good people do bad things? Can bad people do good things? And it just make a complicated world with some more complicated characters.
It's interesting. You're coming from a world of criminal psychology. You're dealing with redemption. You're dealing with hope. You're dealing with survival. You're dealing with a lot of themes in real life. Is this comic a way to kind of decompress from, say, the work effort itself? Is it a way for you to kind of work through areas that legally you can't talk about, things like along that line? Does it help your own mental health to make this comic?
And it absolutely does. I think that it is very heavy stuff that I kind of work with during my day job. And it is nice to be able to come home and jump into, in a sense, a fantasy world where I have full control, right? Because in our lives, we know that we don't usually have full control over other aspects. A part of why I do love comics, and I was a little bit disingenuous in the full control aspect, because you work with a big team. So you have my wonderful artist, Federico Guillen, wonderful letterer, Joey Roditis, editor, Deanna Sukijian. Each one of them has their own inputs. So I might have ideas of how things are supposed to go, but we're working as a team, and everyone's voice is just as important as mine. Although I have ideas, each person's introspection and the ways they want to handle things or the way they think should be taken extremely seriously, especially someone like Fred, because he is my right-hand man. He's become one of my good friends throughout this process, which is honestly the best part of this whole experience. Is I never thought in a million years that I'd write a comic and then make four new really good friends, which has been fantastic. So it's having that control, but also being willing to give up a little bit of that control to these people that you work with who are also experts in their own right, humbling yourself and saying, I'm not an expert at lettering, I'm not an expert at art, and I'm not an expert at editing. So let me take what they say as gospel. I will fight when I think that something that I strongly believe in,
Sure.
but I will take everything that they say extremely seriously. And I know I kind of went a little off tangent on the original question going into a fantasy world, but I think at the heart of it, you're correct, Kurt, that it is leaving that environment.
How did you find this team? Because obviously the internet is a wide world of finding anything and everything that you possibly can, legal or illegal. And but when it comes to creative people, it seems to be a fairly easy process. But what was your approach to finding the people you needed to fill in the gaps that you weren't able to do yourself?
So the most important was going to be the artist. Without the artist, there is no book. Fred is the person who gave life to basically everything and created all these very, very amazingly detailed characters. But I found Fred scouring Reddit, actually. So Reddit was my main source of looking for artists to hire. I actually found a bunch of my variant artists on Reddit as well for variant covers. Found Fred's art. He was a bit more traditional. I think when I was looking on Reddit, I saw his post on the subreddit Hungry Artists and or Artists for Hire. I saw a page, it was just a black and white cityscape, a comic that he did in the past. I think it was a pigeon comic. And it was a black and white page of a pigeon comic. And for some reason, I'm just like, this guy's great with details. I didn't see any of his color work, but he did have a bit of a manga influence.
Okay.
And I think it becomes much clearer in Divine Power that he's very influenced by manga. And throughout the rest, issues 2 through 6, we really, really lean into the manga element even more so. And in issue 2, one of my favorite panels is something straight out of a manga in Japan. Emailed Fred and I gave him the rundown, my pitch, which is completely different than what we have today, honestly, but he loved it. He even told me, he's like, I'm not really working in comics these days anymore. It's been a while. I'm working more on like video game development.
Okay.
He liked the pitch so much that he's like, let's go for this. It sounds like a lot of fun. 3 years later, we have a comic book somehow out in stores across America. I'm still reeling about that. I can't believe it, to literally go from, I love the Comic Cons, New York Comic Con. My wife and I, we go every single year, all 4 days. We go to Boston, Rhode Island. We really, really like the Comic Con scene. To go from just going to Comic Con to having the possibility of having a book at Comic Con is still absolutely mind boggling. That's how I met Fred. Fred and I still chat. We still talk, hoping to do more issues after 6. I will say 6 ends on a relative cliffhanger, but I did originally pitch the story as 12 issues. So I told myself I'm not going to compromise and try to end it 6 issues. I said, if we get past 6, that's great. If we don't, I'm happy we made it that far. Once I was finished talking with Fred, I pitched the story to a couple of different publishers. I think it was 3 total: Image, Dark Horse, and Scout. Scout got back to us. I talked to some people, talked to some lawyers, and then we said we're going to go with Scout. Scout assigned Deanna to the project. Deanna has also become a very close friend throughout the time we've worked together, and she has given tons of artists to help the project, variant artists, but most importantly, she also recommended Joey, who is the letterer. So that's how we got our editor and our letterer. And Joey has also been absolutely wonderful. Joey Roditis. He did a variant cover as well for issue 5. We'll see how many variant covers will actually get published, because I know like issue 1 is the big one. You get lots of variant covers for issue 1. And then after that, it probably dies down to 1 cover per issue. But I'm going to see if I can talk to Scout and do like a limited run of all these variant artists who were excited to get published. So we'll see if that can actually get done.
And then, of course, your letterer. Lettering is a very underrated skill, in my opinion.
Big time.
You need like a top notch letterer for any comic you create.
Yeah, it elevates comics 100% because when Fred and I first pitched the book, we had a different letterer. It was Fred's girlfriend, although she is extremely talented, and I did like the way that she lettered the book. She had never been a letterer before, so she wasn't really too familiar with the American, I guess, style of lettering. I guess I should also mention that Fred is from Argentina, so is his girlfriend. A little bit of possible cultural differentiations with the lettering. And when I spoke to Deanna, she said we need to get a new letterer. So we did. Obviously, I let her know, and she was fine with that. And Fred was also fine with that. We kind of understood that we would probably need a new letterer. Deanna recommended Joey, and I kind of am rather trusting. So I'm like, if you like Joey, then we're going with Joey, and I'm not asking any questions. And it turned out wonderful because Joey has been absolutely spectacular.
It's an art form in itself. I've seen many letterers over the decades, and you know a good letterer from a bad one because honestly, as wonderful as the art is, especially in this comic, I'm talking in general, the art is amazing. If your lettering isn't up to par, it just takes away. It just pulls you away from the story that you're trying to convey. And I'm glad that you found someone, especially with this entire team in
Thank
itself
you.
there. That's definitely great to see. Yeah, that was the one thing I loved about this comic from what I got to read. It felt quick, but the pace was good enough that it kept me engaged because every panel, the detail between the dialogue, between the action that was going on with it, it flowed very nicely from panel to panel. So it was a
Thank
really
you.
good read overall. Can't wait to see what issue 2 comes, but you know, I think
Thank you.
I think it's a definite must read for sure. The fact that you have 6 issues, you want to go to 12, that's a long running series. That is something that you need to have planning. You need to have, you know, your team. You may switch artists down the road. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. What is your game plan, and what is the ultimate goal besides getting it into stores that you currently have for
Mhm.
Divine Power Maybe and maybe other projects you have coming up in the future?
So I always kind of had the idea of having Divine Power Made Me like a longer ongoing series. I know that's a bit like ostentatious and or not the smartest thing in the world to be a first time writer and be like, oh, I have like a 50 issue long running series as if I'm a well-known writer. It's like, well, definitely not smart, but might as well be just ready to go at it for anything. I originally pitched it as 12 issues because I felt like that's the best way to tell Virgil's initial story with the relationship of him and the first god and him and his dad. The first half of the story, the first 6 issues, are more related to Virgil and the first god, and the second half of the story is more related to Virgil and his father. Because as we kind of get the hint in the beginning or the first issue, is Virgil is in the afterlife alone. His parents were also executed by the cult. For some reason, they're not all there at the same time. So he's kind of on this journey to look for his parents. And we have to learn what the motivation is of the first god as well. That first arc is really just finding Virgil's parent and or parents. Then the larger overarching story, you'll kind of find the motivation in issue 4 with the first god. I've kind of planned out 40 issues, I would say. I know it's a lot. It's just the general arcs and overarching story, and then I kind of do big picture, then start to get into smaller arcs and then to smaller issues. So I have about 40 issues planned out, not written, but just planned out, ready to go. I do some classic manga tropes of like near the halfway mark, we'll do like a war arc, which I always love the training arc, some fun things like that. As a first time writer who's just getting into the field, being able to do even 6 issues is a godsend. My mentality has always been be ready for anything and also be ready for nothing. So if we only get to do the 6, I'm perfectly fine with that. I feel like it's wonderful that we were able to do even the 6. But if we can go a little bit further, even up to that 12, I think 12 is where I have the most closure, and I think most readers would have the most closure as well. In regards to other stories, I have some other stories that are just kind of in the works. I have one that is a little bit more fleshed out, like a supernatural comedy war story. Then I have a bit more serious solar punk political drama, which is going to be completely different than Divine Power because it's just going to be a much slower burning candle, much more serious. But those are my two kind of stories that I have the most fleshed out right now, who God only knows if will actually get scripted and or made. And then for extremely wishful thinking, very much so never going to happen, I do have a Marvel story or two or a DC story or two. But again, I'm just saying that because I do have that. I'm not even going to entertain that with the possibility.
I mean, wish it into the world and maybe it'll happen if you're into that type of thing. But I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that you have something available, the fact that you're looking at multiple genres, you're trying to expand yourself as a writer. That's not in a very strict, structured sense when it comes to, obviously comics are very free flowing, but they have a structure of their own, obviously, as you know. But when it comes to, though, the fact that you're jumping to different genres, are you trying to keep yourself engaged in becoming a more proficient writer, or are you trying to find what lane works best for you and then, kind of keep yourself fresh as you go?
I think it's just what I have ideas for and what I am passionate about. I feel like if I'm writing a story personally and I'm not into it or I'm just writing it for the sake of writing it, then it's not going to be good. And I think people will notice that. There's just topics that I'm interested in outside of the action comedy that Divine Power Made Me is. I do think that Divine Power Made Me might have a bit more of a broader audience just because I know manga is really big right now. So is like the action monster kind of horror genre, which I didn't really plan on when I first went in. I just really, really like giant monsters ever since I was a kid. So I'm like, oh, I get to make giant monsters for my book and I get to pay someone to make those giant monsters. That's amazing. So if I could add a giant monster into every single one of my stories, then I absolutely would. But I don't know how a giant monster would fit into a solar punk political drama. Probably no giant monsters in that. But the supernatural war story comedy, solid possibility that I'll throw a giant monster into that.
Never say never on the solar punk, big monster thing, because what if, and here I'm just spitballing, but it's your world, the giant monster is actually the world that everyone is on.
I like it. I like it. It's definitely a possibility. The only problem is I would say it because it's if you've ever read the story Brave New World,
Yes.
it's
Oh,
kind
that's
of
excellent.
based around that. It was actually kind of funny. I was talking to my editor about that story, and I was just giving her a bit of the synopsis of Brave New World. She's like, "How was that ever made?" Because we were mainly talking about in the section of this seeming utopia of how there are the members of society that are created who are purposely given disabilities in order to work at the lower echelons of society. And she's just like, this is horrible, and which it is. That's the whole point of the story, is how
Right.
horrible this is. And I wanted to kind of explore something similar to that seeming utopia. That's a talk for a later date.
Well, you just have to schedule it, and when you get it created, and we'll continue the Aldous Huxley conversation when it
Oh,
comes to the
absolutely.
influence for sure. Because I remember reading that in the library in high school, and Ian Fleming stuff, Margaret Weiss, and so many amazing sci-fi writers, and Asimov, et cetera, et cetera. The giants that
Yeah.
are our favorites. But you look at some of the books that were done back then, which was the 60s, 70s, 80s, compared to 40 plus years later. It's surprising to say that, but the shift of dialogue, the shift of what's prevalent from back then to the themes of today, the struggles are still continuous no matter where you are and no matter what time you're from. But are you going to explore that a little more in depth, either in Divine Power, or are you going to explore that in maybe other themes of your other stories? Because I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. Like everyone struggles, but how do we deal with it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question because when I was originally writing Divine Power Made Me, I actually had some thoughts because I believe the original story was more based around like the Judeo-Christian religion. And you can definitely see the influences in the writing of Divine Power now. But my biggest thing is I didn't want to upset people writing about Judeo-Christianity.
Mhm.
I made up my own religion, made up my own stuff, so no one could kind of be like, oh, this is offensive to religion, blah, 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 because of this, that, and the other thing, just because it's all made up, even though there's going to be influences from stuff that exists, because I don't think anybody can write anything without influences from stuff that exists, because we exist, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Already in Divine Power Made Me, it's a topic about religion. I mean, in the first issue, we have a religious person of authority who is shown to be not a good person, which is, I would say, already a controversial topic, getting into those kinds of things nice and early, but really kind of examining what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a bad person? All topics that are very complicated, and I feel like sometimes a comic doesn't do justice to very complicated topics like this. But nonetheless, going to try to do something with it, see what happens.
The fact that manga is a huge influence as of now, it was an influence for many people growing up in the creative field in itself. But what is the most misunderstood aspect about manga being an influence in your creative writing that people who don't follow manga misunderstand?
I think that now in today's day and age, manga has become so unbelievably huge. I think that I saw the numbers in 2021 or 2022. The numbers for manga sales in the United States were astronomically larger than any comic that was selling, or I guess Western comic. But I think the main misunderstanding is that, at least when I first started watching anime, and which eventually led me into manga, um, is this stigma. Same way that there's a stigma for comics, or there was a larger stigma for comics, probably more so 20, 30 years ago, because now, thanks to Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's become everybody loves Marvel, right? Maybe a little less so these days with the superhero fatigue. Definitely in those past 10 years, because that's how I became big. I mean, I saw Iron Man 1 in theaters as a small, tiny little kid, and then literally grew up watching these movies with my dad. Maybe not so much as my mom, but my mom definitely got into it a little bit near the end as well, seeing the movies in theaters. But it was, I mean, honestly, so great. I come from a family of nerds, so
Nice.
we all loved talking about them, going to see the movies, which and then inevitably led me to reading the comics. I ended up picking up the books. I was definitely a bigger DC guy for a while. I remember the first time I ever picked up The Dark Knight Returns,
Yeah.
and I'm like, this is the greatest thing that's ever been made ever. Slowly reading other things. I remember the first time I read like Brian K. Vaughan's Saga, and I'm like, this is something else. This is incredible. But to kind of circle back towards the manga question, that stigma and the language difference, because I feel like I will mostly watch anime with Japanese voice actors, American subtitles, and there was definitely a stigma to that. I remember the first time I ever jumped into something that I had to read while I was watching the entire time, which then inevitably led me to the reading backwards in a sense of manga.
Right.
But at the end of the day, manga is just black and white comics. I mean, it's no different than anything we really read in the States, except that it's just closer to indie books because you have point one, and there is no confusion about continuity because you have a straight linear story, or you have issue one and then issue 200, right? There's no confusion on, do I need to read this event or this crossover? or all these other things. It's much, much simpler. And I think that that's where a lot of the appeal of manga today is coming from, is it's very easy to get into. We don't need to, how many issue number ones do we have for Spider-Man these days, right? Like when I was looking to get into Doctor Strange, because I love Doctor Strange, I'm like, where do I start? Do I start with Ditko back in the 60s? Or do I start with something that's like out today? And that's kind of what I ended up doing anyway. I started with Jason Aaron, his run, and Chris Bachalo. Yeah, I'm just going to say Chris. And he's actually become one of my favorite artists. I got into collecting original art, and I absolutely adore his art. And I love Jason Aaron's run on that specific Doctor Strange book. But yeah, I think that that is the main appeal of the manga. I also like the shonen story structure, which you'll actually kind of see in Divine Power. I like to implement a bit of the shonen story structure of we have a teenager and or a kid who is coming of age and put into this fantastical world, is given an instructor who is much, 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 much more powerful than them, going through this world and becoming a badass. Because I think early on, you'll kind of see that Virgil is not that. He is kind of this whiny little kid who thinks that he's smarter than everybody else, but he's going to be humbled very, very quickly. And I think issue 2 is the first time that he's humbled pretty significantly. Very quickly realizes that he is not always right. I'm very, very excited for people to see issue 2. I know earlier you were saying that you like the pacing of issue 1, which I really do appreciate. Personally, I think that I tried to fit just a little bit too much in issue 1. I set up the strands for, I believe, 4 stories total. The story of the god, the story of Virgil, the story of Minerva, and then the story of what's going on in the past when he was with the cult. It was just mildly too much, and it gets much better pacing, I think, in issue 2 as well, because each issue will focus on 1 or 2 things instead of those 4 kind of just all being thrown at you.
Minor point here. I think that the fact that you grew up with the Marvel movies is similar to how we grew up with, say, like Star Wars and Star Trek when it was first released. I think there's very parallel geekdoms when it comes to that respect, because it's just another generation enjoying the world of sci-fi, the world of fantasy, the world of action. I mean, it's always going to keep on going. And obviously then there's iconic films. You got Aliens, and then Blade Runner, the original, Indiana Jones, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean,
all incredible. Absolutely amazing.
We're glad to be geeks in whatever decade we grew up in, and we'll continue to be geeks well past us going into the grounds, and then we'll get all the access to everything ever. So there you go. That's my geek heaven.
Yeah, I know. And I think just kind of to jump off of that as well, is good media transcends decades, right? So even though I grew up in the early 2000s, I still also watched Aliens and Predator and Blade Runner and Indiana Jones and Star Wars. I mean, I remember watching the original trilogy. We had them on VHS. Yeah. We watched them on VHS. I watched them many, many, many times. Because I know sometimes those that box set of the 3 OG VHS movies is worth money. Ours are beat up, man. I mean, the box is yellow and it is falling apart. But that just means that it's been loved. Honestly, that's where I think my love of writing and storytelling comes from, is just consuming so much media and being like, I want to add to this media somehow. And I thought that this would be one of the better ways to do that.
No, I like that. That's good. And the fact that you have geek parents is even better.
Oh, yeah.
They refer to Comic Cons as cult meetings. And I'm like, no, it's just a bunch of people getting together. So like a cult. No, we're geeks. There's a difference.
It's so much fun. I mean, my dad took me to New York Comic Con when I was really young. We got some tickets, I believe, for free from somebody that we knew that was in the industry. I mean, when I was younger, I remember thinking it was very strange. And then as I got older, I'm like, this is the coolest place that has ever existed. I would rather be at Comic-Con than anywhere else on the planet because it is so amazing. Best 4 days of the year, at least for New York Comic-Con.
Mhm.
It's my hometown home con, so I'm
Nice.
always going to be partial. I've been to the San Diego one and I love it, but man, there's nothing like a good New York Comic-Con.
Well, what you got to do is come up to Toronto, Ontario, do the 4 day event there, which is the third largest North American Comic Con. So you've been to the largest. You've been to, I think New York is the second largest, and then Toronto is the third. So
Oh, that's so cool.
you got to come up this way. It's
I'm dying to see more of the Comic-Cons throughout the world as well.
nice,
For example, I studied abroad my junior year of college and I studied in Italy.
nice.
And I remember every country I went to when I was in Italy, going to their comic shops because I'm like, I gotta see what's going on here. And I believe that even when I went to London, my wife is British. We wanted to go to like London Comic Con
Mhm.
at least once. Would love to see all of them.
I'm sure you'd want to go to Japan, obviously, and do that amazing manga con or however they call it. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
they have so many of those events. It sounds just incredible.
Absolutely dying to go. I mean, we want to go so badly. We had a trip scheduled 2020.
Uh,
As you could imagine, that trip was canceled. I kept saying, no, 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 there's still a possibility. There's still a possibility it'll happen, just to like keep hope in the back of my mind. I knew there was no way it was ever going to happen. It hasn't been rescheduled since, sadly enough.
I'm sure they will, but keep your fingers crossed and your credit card empty. So
Exactly.
everyone has one person that inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
My father, definitely. I love to tell this story, honestly, because I hated writing when I was a kid. What I used to have to do for middle school papers and or high school papers is my dad was always a very good writer, and he knows he's a good writer, but he's just never really pursued that avenue because of, you know, two kids working all the time, all that stuff. So I could only imagine how difficult writing would be. I hated writing. I mean, I hated homework. I wasn't the biggest fan of school either. My dad would take me into the basement and we'd sit at the family computer and we'd sit there for hours just writing like the one paragraph that I needed to write. And we'd go word by word down whatever I wrote. And he's like, nope, that's a horrible sentence. Let's redo that. Or that's a bad word. Think of another word. And he'd never give me the answer. He'd be like, no, we're just going to go through this. We're going to think about the best way to solve that problem of that sentence, of that punctuation. And we'd sit there for hours. And of course, sometimes that would involve tears. I honestly think that the reason that I am the writer that I am today is because of my dad. He's also obviously my biggest inspiration. I think that, he's got a couple of stories that he wants to tell as well. And I'm really hoping that one day he really finishes whatever stories he has to tell, but he's absolutely my biggest inspiration when it comes to writing.
From a professional standpoint, you are now a successful comic writer. So, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
It is something that many people can't actually say. They always have the idea, but they never execute. So, you have executed. So, you are now in the world of comics. From a professional standpoint, you are successful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
It's interesting that you say that, Kurt, because I I still don't see myself as like a successful professional writer. It still feels more like a hobby than anything else. And I think it's always just going to be that imposter syndrome at the end of the day. But in the general sense of being successful, whatever that might mean, I always think that it's important for all of us to see ourselves as successful. No matter what we're doing in life at that moment, there is something that we can find to be proud of. There is something that we are doing that is worthwhile. It doesn't matter how small it is or how insignificant it might seem to you and or me, but it is important and it is worth continuing. So whatever that might be in our lives, just keep doing it, keep pushing forward with it. As long as you're not hurting yourself or others, it is worth continuing. And in my case, it's the writing. I'm just going to keep pushing forward with it. To answer the question, yes, I do think that I am successful in a general term.
It felt very psychologist in terms of its answer, but I'll accept it either way. The reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
Because there's obviously been a lot of failure in my life. I think we all experience failure. It's just something that it's part of life. And my dad always said that failure is what we do with it. We're all going to fail. It's going to happen no matter what. And it's going to happen a lot for most of us. And it's just a matter of picking yourself back up, getting yourself back on the horse, and just continuing to persevere. This might seem like a very, very silly example because it is a very silly example, but there is a video game called The Binding of Isaac, and I use this as an example just because it's the easiest one and it comes to my mind. But it's a very difficult, it's called a roguelite, where if you die, you go back to the beginning, you lose all your stuff, but there's meta progression. I must have died in that game over 10,000 times, but it's like after thousands of hours in that game, you die, you go back, and honestly, you kind of get really used to failure. And I think that's a good metaphor to have in life, is just to go at it, do things as much as you can, and actually fail a lot, just so that we could kind of all get used to it, or at least me personally get used to it. So the next time it happens, it's not as big of a deal, because obviously when you're first putting all this work, all this effort, and then something goes wrong, it's heartbreaking. And it's okay to feel heartbroken and to feel defeated, but then at the end of the day, pushing forward and going at it again is going to be the most important thing.
The younger generation is looking at your work and they're becoming inspired to be creative in their own way, whether it's as a comic writer or something along the creative spectrum, maybe even inspire them down that path. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
I think that the main thing that I would say is just to keep making comics. And I know that might be a little bit of a cop out of an answer, but at the end of the day, that's the only way that you can inspire people, is just to make something that you love, that you want to share with other people, that you are proud of. And as long as there's at least one person that is a fan of your work, and that person is you, it's all worth your while. It was worth the time, it was worth the money, because you created something that you're proud of. You've put something into the world, and also kind of accepting that once you put this thing into the world, it is no longer yours. You just kind of created it. And almost like in a similar sense, themes of divine power, of, you create another human being, but then once you put that human being into the world, they are no longer yours. They are their own unique person. Same way, once you put a story into the world, it is no longer yours. You'll see how people interpret it. Just make content, make comics, make something that makes you happy as much as it possibly can, and put it out into the world so that you can also inspire other people.
If your life was a comic book, what would its title be? And what would its soundtrack be?
Oof. Okay. That's a great question, because now I really got to think about a title. I got the soundtrack,
Okay.
which is good, but the title would be, I wonder if I just keep it super simple and just keep the title as Tom Drogalis, which is my name. I'll get a little introspective here as well. I know that might not be the answer that you're looking for, but at the end of the day, it's like you are your own story, right? So Tom Drogalis, that's my name. That's the name my parents gave me. I might be named after an uncle, or just liking the name, and there's power in names, right? So that would be the title of my story. It's because I was given that name. That name has power in its own right, because when you say those two words together, because there's a million Toms, right? But if you say Tom with the last name, there might be some other Tom Dragalises, but now I've got that. I don't know. I know might not be the best answer, but The soundtrack right now, I would say, would be Leve, who I'm a huge fan of, who is a pop jazz singer. Greta Van Fleet, I'd say Bob Dylan as the last one. And they've kind of become the soundtrack of my life. And I do listen to them a lot, just even in general.
Well, Tom, I know we could continue talking about your wonderful career here, but we got to save something for the next time you come on the show, obviously. So you're always welcome back on, and I really appreciate you coming on to Geeks Talking today.
Thank you so much, Kurt. It's been an absolute pleasure being able to speak with you, and I really appreciate all the very introspective, deep questions that you were able to ask and allow me to kind of elaborate on. So thank you so much.
Before I let you go, obviously, where can we find you? How can we support you? Any other things that you'd like to promote? Of course, where can we find Divine Power Made Me?
So the best place to find me is going to be, I'm on Instagram as Tom_Drogalis_, Twitter as just Tom Drogalis, TikTok. I think that's actually one of the best places if you want to see the previews of books. I post a lot of content there. Honestly, I post a bunch of spoilers there because I feel like the marketing aspect of this whole entire experience is the hardest part. TikTok, I think my handle is at Fleeple, which I know might be a little strange, but that's just a name that I made for one of my characters in Skyrim, and now it's been my handle everywhere. And I decided just not to change my TikTok for some reason. But more importantly, like you said, the best place to find Divine Power Made Me is going to be the Scout website. It is in previews, so if you want to ask your local comic book shop for Divine Power Made Me, you can ask them for that, and hopefully they'll give it an order. We have the second printing of issue 1 coming out. Scout is doing a relaunch with Element Global, relaunching a couple of titles. So I know that issue 1 initially came out in February. We went through a 6-month dry period of no content of Divine Power, but now I've been told that everything's going to be coming out monthly. Issue 2 will be out, and I've already seen the solicitations for issue 2, and then 3, and so on and so forth.
Well, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our website, tgtmedia.com or twogeekstalking.com. That's TWO. Website is going through complete rebuild because I've been doing this for 15 years, so give me a break. I'm only one person. Find the rest of our interviews, obviously, on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TGTmedia, and on our podcast, twogeekstalking.podbean.com, or just search Two Geeks Talking wherever you get your podcasts. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking.